Cosmic horror is a subgenre that is difficult to adapt. With an expansive mythos of eldritch beings older than the universe itself, it gets under your skin like no other type of horror. Many try to adapt this genre into visual mediums, but most fail. That being said, a small gaming studio based in Ukraine was able to crack it better than most. This is 2019's The Sinking City. Frogwares is a company of roughly 80 employees based in Kiev, Ukraine. Founded by two Frenchmen, Frogwares is a nod to the term froggies, meant to negatively refer to people of French origin who live outside of their country. They started business in 2000 and were mostly known for their Sherlock Holmes games. This franchise of games started in 2002 and is still going, with a recent remake called Sherlock Holmes: The Awakened having been released in 2023. Their games have usually garnered mixed reviews, with their atmosphere and detective mechanics gaining particular praise, but a lot of their work is considered by many to be very janky. The word Eurojank exists for a reason, and while a lot of people give it a negative connotation, I think there is also a lot of charm that comes with it. A small studio from Ukraine isn't and shouldn't be compared to big companies. Of course, this doesn't mean that players should excuse a lack of polish, it just means that expectations should be adjusted accordingly. From what I can tell, Frogwares is a company of very passionate individuals who like a very specific niche, which is detective stories with horror undertones. I myself am a huge fan of this genre. I've read most Sherlock Holmes stories and I'm a big fan of Lovecraft's work. The idea of humanity being only but a speck of dust in a much larger and older universe gives us a sense of dread that most types of horror don't even come close to achieving. Not only this, but the fact that most characters end up insane or suffering from some kind of psychosis gives these stories very real stakes and makes the forbidden knowledge of these eldritch beings all the more terrifying. The Sinking City came out on June 27, 2019. It was originally released for Windows, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One, later receiving a remaster in the 13th of May of 2025 for Windows, PlayStation 5, and Xbox Series S and X. Like most of their games, The Sinking City received mixed to positive reviews, with many criticizing the game's combat mechanics as being slow and clunky, while also having other technical issues like screen tearing and long loading times. It was also praised, however, for its atmosphere, world building, and detective mechanics. There's also another issue that is impossible not to mention when talking about the game. Although The Sinking City was developed by Frogwares, the publishing was handled by Bigden Interactive, now known as Nacon SA. The developers took their publishers to French court as they alleged that Bigden was actually holding off payments and acting as if The Sinking City was an IP they owned. In reality, they only had the publishing royalties, and so they lost the case. The game at that time had been delisted in most platforms because of this incident and later returned, with Frogwares having reclaimed their IP. In March 2024, they revealed their work on a sequel while being in the middle of the Russian invasion. This means they are directly being affected by daily attacks and a constant fear for their lives, which makes it not only very commendable that they're still working on their art, but it's genuinely inspiring to see these people in the middle of an actual conflict trying to find some kind of normalcy by doing what they love to do most, creating video games. In this regard, I have to preface that although their games suffer from clunky animations and technical problems, these guys are showing passion for their craft, unlike many others. But let's talk about the game itself. The Sinking City starts with our protagonist, Charles Reed, waking up in shambles from a nightmare. He's trying to get medication for his psychosis when the boat he's in seems to end up in a very strange place. He sees a large tentacle monster above him, and it seems that he is underwater. He stares down at a mysterious city beneath him and seemingly jumps to his death. Of course, this was only a dream, but it tells us a couple of things. Charles Reed isn't all there and is obviously suffering from some kind of mix between PTSD and schizophrenia. This, along with the fact that Reed looks at an old picture of himself with a crew of sailors, hints at the player that they might have found something they weren't supposed to, making them go mad. Reed had actually previously been in an asylum after learning this forbidden knowledge. After investigating the boat and retrieving our weapon, we encounter a man called Johannes Vanderberg. Reed is a private eye suffering from strange visions, and he contacted Vanderberg to research this phenomenon. It turns out that a lot of people living in the sinking city, get it? Of Oakmont, are experiencing similar symptoms after an event called the Flood. During this incident, storms raged for several weeks, and the water rose without ever receding. This was unfortunately accompanied by strange visions and the population of Oakmont going mad. Johannes tells us that someone named Robert Throgmorton might help us. He's a very influential man in the Oakmont community, and there is no one better than him to give us assistance. The thing is, Robert's son has disappeared, and of course, before helping us, we have to do him a favor and find his son. This is pretty much the formula of the main story. Reed needs information, but to acquire it, he needs to do someone some favors, which most of the time implies talking to other people who also need favors. It works fine during the first half of the game, but I would be lying if I said it didn't start to get repetitive after the midway point. Throgmorton is interesting, to say the least. He doesn't look quite human, as you can see, and he has a big disdain for Innsmouthers. The people of Innsmouth were first introduced in Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth. In this novella, they are described as very strange people with fish-like features like bulging eyes and scaly skin. This is called the Innsmouth look, and it seems to run in certain family bloodlines. Innsmouth was recently destroyed, and now they have migrated to Oakmont. Many are displeased by this and show strong signs of xenophobia against the Innsmouthers, and Throgmorton is definitely one of them. The gameplay properly starts with us searching for his son. We can use this game's version of detective mode or Witcher senses to find doors and objects we can interact with, as well as view past events, in which the player has to order these events in a correct order to advance the plotline. We can also inspect clues, which are then stored in our case study, and make deductions in our mind palace, similar to what Remedy eventually did with Alan Wake 2. After we make certain deductions, we can choose one of two options, giving the player the chance to truly roleplay as a detective. These choices also have an effect in the story and the world around you, making this system feel very satisfying to use. We find a fisherman next to a dead body. It seems he lost consciousness, and when he woke up, his friend Paul was killed and the culprit had run away. Right off the bat, I want to focus on how great the faces of the characters look. These characters look very vivid, especially in their eyes and mouth. This makes interactions feel very immersive and detective work more enjoyable. It seems this fisherman was working with Throgmorton's son, making him an initial suspect in the case. By finding clues in the environment, we can deduce that Albert Throgmorton woke up in some sort of possession which spread hysteria through the fisherman. After being hurt, he fled. We use our mind's eye to find a trail, but we have to be very careful. When we use this mode, Reed's sanity meter goes down, which makes him see things that aren't there, as well as hear constant whispers. This also makes it hard for the player to know which enemies are real, as well as making it harder for you to see what's around you, since the visuals become heavily distorted. When you lose all your sanity, you die, although this never happened to me. To counteract this, we can either use light RPG mechanics in the Skills tab to upgrade our sanity meter, or take antipsychotics, which pretty much serve as the first aid kit for your sanity. We find Albert dead hanging from a hook and are then attacked by Lovecraftian creatures called the wild beasts. They don't pose much of a threat, but since this is our first combat encounter, the player might be taken by surprise. We then try to discover who the culprit of this murder is and find an Innsmouther in a nearby bar to be the one responsible. He tells us he wasn't in control of his actions. At this point, we get to access Reed's mind palace and make a choice. Is he guilty or not? This will influence the outcome of this case, as Reed can either turn him to Throgmorton or tell his client the culprit died, giving this man a second chance. I personally covered for him, as I know for a fact that he was possessed by hysteria. Throgmorton is obviously affected by this news and it fuels his racism towards Innsmouthers even further, but accepts to help us. This is where our second case, Lost at Sea, begins. Throgmorton had an expedition that was exploring a crack underwater, which they thought could be related to the visions. He gives us a key and we have to open our map and find out where the headquarters are, as the game doesn't give us waypoints immediately. Rather, we get a general indication of where to go and we have to manually insert the waypoint in the map. In the expedition's headquarters, we find it vandalized. Several Innsmouthers had broken in and burnt all the papers related to the expedition. This is where the game introduces a new mechanic. We can go to the local newspaper, police department, or hospital and research certain events, crimes, and people. This makes the player feel like they are doing real detective work, which I think is very refreshing to see in a game like this. In here, we choose the right filters and gain access to a new clue. The Innsmouthers had left Oakmont on a freighter, and we can see the original advertisement giving us the name of this ship. When we get to the port, however, we find wild beasts everywhere and the crew dead. When it comes to combat, this is where the game gets a lot of flack. The combat mechanics are nothing to write home about. You point and you shoot. It's slow and kind of wonky, and it sometimes feels like you missed your shot when you didn't, and it's overall not nearly as responsive as other games with higher budgets. That being said, I actually had quite a bit of fun with some encounters, and I overall think the hate is a bit disproportionate. At the same time, I am very familiar with clunky combat mechanics since I've been playing survival horror games all my life, so I might just be used to it. I did really like the reloading animations though, and the Tommy gun feels amazing to use, as well as the shotgun. We then discovered that a similar thing happened to this crew to what happened to the fisherman. The crew went berserk with hysteria, but the captain, named Sanders, was able to run away. We find him in the local hospital, and after some resistance, he eventually tells us what happened. The freighter belonged to Throgmorton's expedition, and the crew, particularly Albert, went insane after finding something underwater. The crew escaped and left some unlucky scientists there. Whatever they saw in the cracks in the seabed made everyone go insane. After this information, Reed figures out that the best idea is to get to the root of the issue and dive underwater. I don't know about you, but if I were Reed, I would stay the hell away from any type of overall moist substances. We find a diving suit in a factory and pursue our clues underwater. These sections feel very refreshing at first, but because of their sluggish nature, can start to feel a bit boring after a while. I also had an issue where I shot some enemies underwater, and instead of them dying, they just stood there looking at me. I'm not sure if the weapon is only supposed to stun them or if this is a bug, but it definitely didn't feel right. After some detectiving, we find that the scientists were found by Innsmouthers, and they kidnapped Professor Doe, who was in charge of the expedition, who they mention as the Seed, and took an artifact called the Seal. This will eventually lead us to a woman called Anna. She is a part of something called the EOD, which she explains is an organization that stands for Everyone's Obvious Duty, who focuses on helping the poor. She calls Charles by Charlie and seems way too nice. Like, way too nice. She gives us another task before helping us out, but betrays us in the end, which made me have my own Joker moment. We are then approached by a man named Fred, and he asks us, you guessed it, to help him out in exchange for information on Professor Doe's whereabouts. You know, after searching so hard for this Professor Doe, I really hope we get some bread. At this point, the game starts to become a bit repetitive, and it doesn't help that the city is way too big for its own good. I feel that if it were trimmed, the game would have been a lot more effective. At the same time though, I know the developers did this so that the player really needs to use the map to find out where to go, and if the town were smaller, it would have been way too easy. Ultimately, I think it's a trade-off that needed some tweaking. Anyway, we have to find a way so that Fred can flee from the city, which is impossible at this moment since he's a member of the OD and they don't treat deserters nicely. We need to be in the good graces of an old man called Brutus Carpenter. He was recently attacked and taken to a morgue, where he managed to wake up and see a double of himself. Of all the weird things that happen in Oakmont, clones wasn't in my bingo card. Luckily for him, he managed to escape, but now we have to help him. In search for clues, we explore his mansion and discover that his son, who uses half a mask to cover a war wound, is taking control of the family. He is also helping the poor, something which his father would never. We also find Brutus's double, just hanging around and taking his place.
What are you doing? What are you doing?
Nothing. Me? Just hanging around.
So what's going on here? From what we can gather, the EOD used some sort of cosmic power to create clones of Brutus and tried to kill the original so that Graham would take control of the family. Obviously, they didn't expect Brutus to survive. After finding an underwater cave filled with mad zealots, we then have one of the only boss battles in the game. It's actually a pretty decent boss fight as we fight off other enemies while throwing grenades or shooting into the mouth of a strange monster. The monster design actually reminds me of something out of Eternal Darkness. We then go back to Brutus and tell him that his son and the EOD were responsible for the whole thing. Carpenter helps Fred flee the city and he gives us a clue to where to find Professor Doe. He managed to set up a meeting with Evernote Blackwood, one of the EOD's top brass, so that we can interrogate him. Of course, nothing ever happens as expected, and Blackwood is missing after being attacked by, and I'm not joking, the KKK. After we find the Grand Wizard, we ask him to do some magic tricks for us and shoot him in the face.
Oh, a wizard. Like Houdini. Yeah, show me a magic trick.
What the druck did you just say to me?
Come on, Gord. Don't be shy. Pull a rabbit out of a hat, or maybe a hood would be more appropriate.
That's enough out of your kisser, you little weasel!
I want to comment on how great of a protagonist Charles Reed is. He is the typical worn-down detective with a raspy voice who monologues endlessly. But his ironic wit actually made me laugh quite frequently. He looks like he hasn't slept in years, but he still manages to find the energy to make sarcastic remarks in front of the most evil people you've ever seen. After satisfyingly killing a bunch of clan members, we eventually discover that Evernote is hidden in an underwater cave. He tells us he was actually planning on waging war on the EOD, and that he is trying to stop whatever is happening. He tells us that Professor Doe is one of the chosen ones, also known as the Seed. The EOD want her to release the daughter of Cthulhu, while Evernote believes she can stop this from happening. It turns out Reed is also the Seed. When we find Harriet Doe, we can either kill her and take her place or try to save her. Unfortunately, we abruptly wake up on land with the seal having disappeared from our hands. A man with a rather fine Irish accent saved us, but he doesn't tell us where the seal is, and Harriet Doe has appeared to have died. We explore the Blackwood Manor and eventually find the seal, as well as uncover a few things. It turns out Evernote was trying to remove the visions from the seeds, but every single one eventually died in the process. This led to countless deaths and makes us wonder if he can help Reed with his visions or if he'll end up killing him. When we later find Blackwood, we get to decide if we want to proceed with the ritual or not. I chose to risk it since Reed is already in a no-win scenario, but this obviously goes very wrong and he gets possessed and kills Blackwood. But at least now we have the seal of Cthigonar, the prison where the daughter is being held at, and with Blackwood dealt, we are nearing the end of the game. After a few cases, we finally get to the end game. This unfortunately involves getting 3 key items to complete the seal and choose to either open the doors of Cthigonar and let the daughter loose, or close it for another couple of centuries and give humanity some more time. One thing that I love during this part is how beautiful the Borealis looks in the sky and how the weather is getting more and more unsettling. It really gives off the vibe that we are nearing a cataclysmic event. We find these pieces of the seal in 3 different monoliths before we head down to the last area of the game. In here we go through another underwater level until we are faced with a scripted section that makes us go through various areas we previously visited. In here we find many of the side characters we encountered during the story, telling us why we should choose one ending over the other. Once we get to our destination, we can either sacrifice ourselves or open the gates of Cthigonar. I decided to let Reed off himself since I feel like he is a man with a strong sense of justice, even though he is far from perfect. After this, we see one of the most abrupt endings I have ever seen in a video game. He jumps, there's a scene of Vanderberg smirking, and it ends. I couldn't believe that was it, but it was. Of course, stories from the Cthulhu mythos usually end up badly, but there's a difference between a bad ending and an ending being bad, if you know what I mean. And that is The Sinking City. I found myself being enthralled by the atmosphere, the story itself, and how close and accurately it depicts the source material. Oakmont is a great setting. You can almost feel the terrible fish smell as you play. If Sony ends up developing that smell function for certain games, I hope this isn't one of them. I am a huge sucker for these kinds of settings, and seeing old cars in the road and bright neon signs emitting light in the darkness as the rain pours does something for my brain. Something I was also very surprised was the overall voice acting and the characters' faces. Reed is portrayed in such a way that makes him one of those detective characters that are so representative of the genre that it almost looks like parody, while being executed with such confidence that it makes him unironically a great character. Now I want to talk about a few complaints I did have with the game, just to be fair. The first one is that Reed's movements feel a little off. It's hard to explain. I think maybe he feels too light when moving around, but something definitely feels off. This, I will admit, only bothered me at the beginning though. I feel like the biggest problem with The Sinking City is how big it is. The game took me over 20 hours to finish, and I felt like it was far too long for this type of game. I would have much rather play a 12-hour game at most than one that took me 20 hours without playing the side content. Yeah, I didn't play much of the side quests because I thought the game was already overstaying its welcome. It doesn't help that, like I mentioned before, the map is way too large. The traversal is also interrupted a lot of the times due to an area being flooded and you have to take a boat to move around. This is a neat idea and it gives Oakmont a lot of personality and atmosphere, but for the player it can become a bit frustrating. We also have phone booths we can use to fast travel, but by the end you'll just be fast traveling everywhere, which makes me wonder why we need the boat in the first place. There are also infected areas which are filled with monsters where the player can actually get more loot, but as far as I know you can't ever clear them. Basically they keep respawning and so does the loot, which makes them feel a little bit inconsequential and overall not worth it a lot of the time. I also found myself getting stuck a lot because of how hard it is to sometimes find clues. I'm not sure if it's because how small the prompt is, but I found myself walking around the same areas over and over without understanding what I was missing. You have to be very particularly positioned to be able to interact with a clue, which makes sense for a detective game. It should require the player to actually look at the environment to find things of importance, but at the same time I think they might have overdone it. Sometimes I even interacted with clues I had already found, just to give me the fake feeling that I was actually going anywhere. I'm also not the biggest fan of the skills tab, as I found it to be kind of just there, and I would only remember I had points to spend after a long time, as it never really impacted my game too much. But these complaints aside, as a huge fan of Lovecraft's work, I absolutely loved The Sinking City. It made me feel like a detective in ways that only Alan Wake 2 managed to accomplish. Not only this, but the atmosphere feels very much representative of those stories I adore. Oakmont is perfectly realized as this fishing town with weird people living in dread and strange cults hiding in the shadows. I also really like the sanity mechanics and how using your mind's eye directly affects them. It's very simple stuff, but it does a splendid job in making you feel like Reed is barely holding on. I also ended up loving Charles Reed as a character, and everyone involved in the voice cast is simply phenomenal to a level I didn't quite expect. It makes these cases come to life, and it makes it easier to power through some of the repetition. The combat is also pretty decent. It's not amazing, but I had a lot of fun during some encounters, which I didn't expect after reading some reviews. I have very deep respect for Frogwares, as their passion shows. The Sinking City 2 is going to have more of a survival horror approach with a heavier focus on combat, like the recent Resident Evil remakes. This makes me very excited, but I hope they don't nerf the detective element too much. They have already stated that these mechanics aren't going to be needed to move the story forward, but it will help you gain upgrades and special equipment. I'm not sure if I like the idea of not having to use the detective mechanics to move the story along, but it's way too early to judge. Suffice it to say, I'm very excited for the sequel, and it's now one of my most anticipated games. We still don't have a release date, but the game is already extremely successful, having made $500,000 on Kickstarter to fund the development costs. Hopefully it delivers, and I will be here when it releases. Although the first game isn't perfect, it's one of the most successful attempts at adapting Lovecraft's work to a visual medium I have seen. I would definitely highly recommend it to any fans of cosmic horror. Thank you so much for watching the video, and if you want more of this type of content, please mention it in the comments. You can also give me suggestions of other games you want me to make retrospectives on. You can also help me on Buy Me a Coffee, as I very much want to invest in equipment like an Elgato to record my own footage, which I'm not able to do at this moment. I appreciate everyone's support, and I'll see you next time.